At 4 a.m. on June 27, 1995, most of Mason City, Iowa, was still wrapped in sleep. But for Jodi Huisentruit, the alarm clock's shrill cry meant another early morning, another day of bringing news to the breakfast tables of north-central Iowa. The 27-year-old anchor at KIMT-TV had a face that radiated warmth through television screens, the kind of genuine smile that made viewers feel like they were getting their morning news from a friend. She had everything ahead of her: a rising career in broadcast journalism, a close-knit circle of friends, and dreams that stretched far beyond the flatlands of Iowa. But Jodi Huisentruit would never make it to work that morning, and she would never be seen again. The story of what happened in those dark pre-dawn hours has become one of America's most perplexing missing persons cases, a mystery that has consumed investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths for nearly 3 decades. It's a case where every answer breeds more questions, where the evidence is simultaneously abundant and maddeningly insufficient, and where the passage of time has only deepened the shadows rather than illuminated the truth. Mason City in 1995 was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. Situated in northern Iowa, about 2 hours south of Minneapolis, it was a community of roughly 30,000 souls, large enough to have its own television station and newspaper, small enough that a friendly face at the grocery store was more common than a stranger. The town had given America Meredith Willson, composer of The Music Man, and it carried that same wholesome Midwestern identity into the mid-90s. This was a place where violent crime was an aberration, where children rode bikes until streetlights came on, and where a young woman living alone in an apartment complex could feel reasonably safe. Jodi had moved to Mason City in 1993, taking a job as a producer at KIMT before quickly moving into an on-air role. By 1995, she was co-anchoring the morning news, which meant impossibly early wake-up calls and a schedule that had her heading to the station while most people were still deep in REM sleep. Those who knew her described a woman who lit up every room she entered, vivacious, ambitious, and genuinely kind. She wasn't just playing a role for the cameras. Colleagues and friends unanimously recalled her authentic warmth, her quick laugh, and her determination to make it in the competitive world of broadcast journalism. The evening of June 26th had been ordinary in every way that would later seem extraordinary. Jodi had attended a neighbor's surprise birthday party at the Southbridge Mall, where she'd been her typical effervescent self, joking, laughing, celebrating with friends. She'd worn a white blouse and black shorts, her blonde hair catching the light as she moved through the small gathering. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or concern. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't saying cryptic goodbyes. She was simply Jodi, bright, engaged, looking forward to an upcoming vacation she'd been planning. After the party, she'd stop by the apartment of her close friend, Annie Cruz. The two women had known each other for years, a friendship that went back to their college days at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. They talked about ordinary things, vacation plans, work schedules, the mundane details that fill friendly conversations. Jodi mentioned she needed to be up early for work, her usual routine. Around 11 p.m., she left Annie's apartment and drove the short distance back to her own place at the Key Apartments, a tidy complex on the north side of Mason City. It was the last time Annie would see her friend alive. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The Key Apartments sat on North Kentucky Avenue, a quiet residential area where Jodi occupied apartment number 2. She parked her red Mazda Miata in her assigned spot, number 48, directly outside her unit. The sporty little car was quintessentially Jodi, bright, fun, suggesting someone who enjoyed life. She locked it, walked a few feet to her apartment door, and disappeared inside. Security in the complex was minimal. This was Mason City in the 90s, after all. There were no surveillance cameras, no security guards, just residents coming and going as they pleased, trusting in the basic safety of their community. Inside her apartment, Jodi prepared for the next morning, as she did every workday. She set her alarm for 3 a.m., a brutal wake-up time that came with the territory of morning news. She needed to be at the KMT studios by 4 a.m. to prepare for the broadcasts that would air at 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. It was a schedule that required discipline and dedication, but Jodi had both in abundance. She was building something, climbing the ladder in a field she loved, and early mornings were simply the price of admission. But when 3 a.m. arrived on June 27th, something went wrong. The exact sequence of events remains one of the most debated aspects of this case, but what investigators would later piece together suggests that Jodi either slept through her alarm or something prevented her from leaving her apartment at her usual time. At 4 a.m., producer Amy Kunz was at the KMT station, prepping for the morning broadcast and expecting Jodi to walk through the door at any moment. 4 o'clock came and went. So did 4:10. By 4:20, Amy was worried enough to pick up the phone. She called Jodi's apartment. The phone rang and rang until Jodi's voice, bright and cheerful on the answering machine, invited the caller to leave a message. Amy hung up and tried again. Still no answer. This wasn't like Jodi. She was reliable, professional, the kind of person who showed up early and stayed late. Amy waited a few more minutes, tension building in her chest, then called again. This time, around 4:30 a.m., Jodi answered. But her voice wasn't its usual morning brightness. She sounded groggy, confused, rushed. "Oh my God, I overslept," Jodi said, the panic evident even through the phone line. She told Amy she'd be there as quickly as she could. Amy could hear the urgency, the scramble of someone who'd been jolted awake and was now racing against the clock. They hung up. Amy assumed Jodi was throwing on clothes, grabbing her things, running out the door. The station was only a few miles away. Even with rushed preparation, Jodi should have been able to make it to work by 5 a.m. at the latest. But 5 a.m. came and went. So did 5:30. By 6 a.m., when Jodi should have been on the air, delivering the morning news with her trademark smile, her chair sat empty. The station scrambled to cover, but Amy's worry had transformed into genuine alarm. This wasn't a flat tire or a minor delay. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, that primal instinct that something terrible had happened in the 90 minutes since their phone call. At 7 a.m., as the sun rose over Mason City on what would be a warm summer day, a co-worker named Tony Benda drove to Jodi's apartment. What he found in parking spot 48 would transform a story about a missing anchor into one of Iowa's most notorious criminal cases. Jodi's red Mazda Miata was still there, parked in its assigned spot. But something was horribly, viscerally wrong. The car's door stood open, as if Jodi had been interrupted mid-entry or mid-exit. Her belongings were scattered across the pavement in a chaotic pattern that screamed violence. Her red high-heeled shoes, the professional pumps she would have worn on air, lay separated from each other near the vehicle. Her blow-dryer rested on the asphalt. Her earrings sparkled in the morning light, torn or dropped in what had clearly been a struggle. The keys, her car keys, which should have been in her hand as she prepared to drive to work, were nowhere to be seen inside the vehicle or in the immediate vicinity. But the most chilling detail was this. A white palm print marked the side of the car, clearly visible against the red paint. It was positioned in a way that suggested someone had braced themselves against the vehicle, perhaps during a struggle, or had been pushed forcefully against the exterior. The print would later be determined to be Jodi's own, a silent testimony to whatever terror had unfolded in this parking spot in the darkness before dawn. Tony Benda stood there in the early morning light, his mind trying to process what his eyes were telling him. This wasn't someone who'd simply decided to take off, for parts unknown. This was a crime scene. This was violence. This was abduction. He immediately called the Mason City Police Department, and within minutes, the quiet parking lot of the Key Apartments was transformed into an active investigation site. Police officers arrived to find the scene largely undisturbed. Jodi's apartment door was locked, but when officers gained entry, everything inside appeared normal. There were no signs of struggle within the apartment itself, no indication that she'd been attacked inside her home. Her purse was inside. Her identification was there. Whatever had happened outside, in the parking lot, as Jodi had made her way to her car. The most likely scenario was that she'd exited her apartment, walked to her vehicle with her work items, the shoes, the blow dryer, the earrings, and had been ambushed by someone waiting in the pre-dawn darkness. The timeline was crucial. Jodi had spoken to Amy at approximately 4:30 a.m., saying she'd overslept but was rushing to work. Between that phone call and 7 a.m., when Tony discovered the scene, something catastrophic had occurred. But the window was likely much narrower than that. Jodi wouldn't have dawdled after that wake-up call. She was panicked about being late. Investigators believed she had probably left her apartment between 4:30 and 5 a.m. at the latest, which meant that in the darkness of a summer morning, in a parking lot outside a residential complex in safe, sleepy Mason City, Iowa, someone had been waiting for her. Or had they? The question of whether this was a targeted attack or a crime of opportunity would become one of the central debates of the investigation. Had someone known Jodi's schedule, known she'd be alone in that parking lot at that ungodly hour? Or had someone simply been prowling the area, looking for a victim, and stumbled upon a young woman alone and vulnerable? The crime scene itself offered tantalizing clues, but frustrating ambiguities. The scattered personal items suggested a sudden, violent encounter. The positioning of objects indicated Jodi had probably been carrying multiple items, trying to juggle her shoes, her blow dryer, her belongings as she rushed to her car. The open car door suggested she'd either been grabbed before she could enter the vehicle or had been in the process of entering when she was attacked. The missing keys raised questions. Had the attacker taken them? Were they still clutched in Jodi's hand when she was taken? Had they fallen somewhere investigators hadn't yet found? Neighbors were questioned, but in the pre-dawn hours, most had been asleep. The Key Apartments complex was quiet at 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. No one reported hearing screams, though one neighbor later recalled possibly hearing what sounded like a scream around that time, but had dismissed it, assuming it was something innocuous, kids, an animal, the random sounds that populate the night. No one had seen vehicles that didn't belong in the parking lot. No one had noticed anything unusual. But someone had been there. Someone had waited in that parking lot, or had approached at exactly the wrong moment. Someone had grabbed Jodi Huisentruit, had overpowered a healthy 27-year-old woman who had every reason to fight for her life, and had taken her away. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple and impossibly complex. Who? As news of Jodi's disappearance spread through Mason City that morning, the community reacted with shock and disbelief. This didn't happen here. Not in Mason City. Not to someone like Jodi. The police department, unaccustomed to cases of this magnitude, immediately contacted state and federal authorities. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation was brought in. The FBI would soon join the investigation. What began as a missing persons case was almost immediately treated as something far more sinister, a likely abduction, possibly murder, though without a body. The latter remained speculation. The parking lot at the Key Apartments was cordoned off. Evidence technicians photographed every detail, collected every item, dusted for fingerprints on the car and surrounding surfaces. The red Miata was impounded and subjected to exhaustive forensic examination. Jodi's apartment was thoroughly searched, though it yielded little of investigative value. It was simply the home of a young professional woman interrupted mid-preparation for work. Her plans, her appointments, her daily life had all been derailed by whatever had happened in parking spot 48. As that first day wore on, the investigation expanded rapidly. Police began interviewing everyone in Jodi's life, friends, co-workers, acquaintances, people she'd interacted with recently. They pulled phone records, looking for unusual calls or patterns. They examined her mail, her calendar, her daily routines, searching for anything that might explain why someone would want to harm this universally beloved young woman. And they came back to that central, haunting question. Who benefits from Jodi Huisentruit being gone? Who had motive? Who had opportunity? Who had been in that parking lot in the darkest hours of a summer morning? The answer, as it turned out, would be far more complicated than anyone imagined. Because Jodi Huisentruit, the friendly face of morning news in Mason City, had been living a life that was both ordinary and, investigators would discover, touched by complications that none of her closest friends fully understood. There were admirers, some appropriate, some uncomfortably persistent. There were relationships, some clear, some ambiguous. There were people who knew her schedule, who knew she'd be alone in that parking lot, who knew she'd be vulnerable in those pre-dawn hours. And somewhere among those people, investigators believed, was the person who had taken her. The person who had turned an ordinary Tuesday morning into a nightmare. The person who had ensured that Jodi Huisentruit would become a name synonymous not with journalism or promise, but with mystery and unresolved tragedy. As the sun set on June 27, 1995, Jodi had been missing for more than 12 hours. Her face would soon be plastered on missing persons posters across Iowa and beyond. Her story would become national news. Her disappearance would launch one of the most extensive investigations in Iowa history. But despite thousands of tips, numerous suspects, and decades of dedicated police work, one fact remains unchanged. From the moment she vanished from that parking lot, Jodi Huisentruit has never been seen again. The clock had started ticking on a mystery that would consume a community, baffle investigators, and remain unsolved for nearly 30 years and counting. The crime scene at the Key Apartments parking lot told a story, but like all the best mysteries, it was a story written in a language that required careful translation. As the sun climbed higher on that June morning, investigators meticulously documented every detail, understanding that what they collected in these first crucial hours might be the only physical evidence they'd ever have. The scattered belongings, the open car door, that haunting white palm print on red paint. Each element was a word in a sentence they desperately needed to read. Detective J.D. Smith of the Mason City Police Department was among the first to arrive at the scene. A veteran officer in a department that rarely handled violent crimes. He immediately recognized they were dealing with something beyond their typical workload. The scene had an eerie quality to it, frozen in time, as if Jodi might return at any moment to collect her scattered shoes and continue on to work. But the violence implicit in the arrangement of objects told a different story entirely. The red high-heeled shoes were examined first. They lay several feet apart, suggesting they'd either been dropped during a struggle or had been kicked off as Jodi fought against her attacker. These weren't casual shoes. They were professional pumps, the kind a news anchor would wear on camera. One shoe rested near the rear of the vehicle, the other closer to the driver's side door. Investigators photographed them from multiple angles, noting their positions precisely. The shoes told them Jodi had probably been carrying them rather than wearing them, a common practice for someone making a short trip from apartment to car in the pre-dawn hours. The blow dryer was equally telling. It lay on the asphalt near the vehicle, still plugged into nothing, a mundane object transformed into evidence of interrupted routine. Jodi would have used it at the station to prepare for broadcast. The fact that it was outside the car suggested she'd been carrying multiple items, perhaps juggling them as she approached her vehicle, vulnerable and distracted in that moment when hands are full and attention is divided. But it was the palm print that drew the most immediate attention, clearly visible on the side of the Miata. Positioned at roughly shoulder height on the passenger side, the white print stood out starkly against the red paint. Investigators carefully photographed and preserved it, hoping it might belong to the attacker. The subsequent analysis would prove both illuminating and frustrating. The print was Jodi's own. She had braced herself against her own car, either during the initial assault or while trying to resist being forced away from the vehicle. The positioning suggested she'd been pushed or had pushed back against someone, her palm making contact with enough force to leave a visible mark. What the print couldn't tell them was equally important. Whose hands had been on Jodi herself? Who had overpowered her? The print was evidence of struggle, but it offered no direct identification of the perpetrator. The car door standing open presented its own set of questions. Had Jodi opened it herself before being attacked? Had the attacker opened it after subduing her, perhaps looking for something inside the vehicle? The door's position suggested Jodi had been in the process of either entering or preparing to enter when the attack occurred. The most logical reconstruction had her approaching the vehicle, possibly unlocking it, beginning to place items inside or prepare to get in, when someone grabbed her. But where were the keys? This became one of the most perplexing elements of the physical evidence. Jodi's car keys, apartment keys, and any other keys she would have been carrying were missing. They weren't in the car. They weren't in the parking lot. They weren't in her apartment. The absence of keys suggested several possibilities. The attacker had taken them, perhaps to prevent Jodi from escaping or to gain access to her apartment later. They were still with Jodi, wherever she'd been taken. Or they'd fallen somewhere outside the immediate crime scene and hadn't been recovered. The missing keys also raised a darker possibility that investigators had to consider. Had someone with access to Jodi's keys been waiting for her? Could the attacker have let themselves into her apartment earlier, surprised her there, and then staged the parking lot scene to misdirect the investigation? This theory was ultimately dismissed because neighbors hadn't reported hearing anything from inside Jodi's apartment, and the evidence inside her home showed no signs of disturbance. But in those early days, every possibility had to be explored. Investigators expanded their search beyond the immediate crime scene. They walked the entire Key Apartments complex, looking for anything that seemed out of place. They searched nearby dumpsters, concerned that evidence might have been quickly disposed of. They examined other vehicles in the parking lot, looking for damage, for blood, for anything that might connect another car to Jodi's disappearance. They interviewed every resident, asking what they'd seen or heard in the hours around 4:30 a.m. One neighbor's account stood out. John Vances, a 48-year-old man who lived in the same apartment complex and had developed a close friendship with Jodi, reported that he'd seen her the previous evening at the birthday party. He described her as being in good spirits, laughing and socializing. But more significantly, he mentioned that Jodi had called him around 4 a.m. that very morning, just 30 minutes before she called the station to say she'd overslept. According to Vances, Jodi had asked him for a wake-up call, concerned she might not hear her alarm. He said he'd called her back around 4 a.m. as requested, spoken briefly with her, and that had been their last contact. This detail immediately caught investigators' attention. Why would Jodi call Vances for a wake-up call? She had an alarm clock. She'd successfully woken up for early shifts hundreds of times before. Was there something more to their relationship than Vances was indicating? And why had she still overslept if he'd called her at 4 a.m.? The timeline was tight and confusing. If Vances called at 4 a.m. and Jodi called the station at 4:30 a.m., saying she'd overslept, what had happened in those 30 minutes? Vances would become one of the most scrutinized figures in the investigation, but in those first hours, he was simply another witness providing information about Jodi's last known activities. Investigators noted his statements and moved on to the dozens of other people who needed to be interviewed. The forensic examination of Jodi's Mazda Miata was exhaustive. Technicians went over every inch of the vehicle's interior and exterior, looking for fingerprints, hair, fibers, blood, or any other trace evidence that might identify who had been in contact with the car. They found Jodi's fingerprints throughout the interior, exactly as expected. They found the palm print on the exterior, but frustratingly, they found no clear evidence of anyone else. If the attacker had touched the car, they'd been careful or lucky, or the evidence had degraded in the hours between the attack and the discovery of the scene. The interior of the car was examined for signs that Jodi had been forced inside it, a terrifying scenario investigators had to consider. Could she have been abducted in her own vehicle, then either driven away or transferred to another car? The seat positioning, the mirrors, the steering wheel, all were adjusted to Jodi's proportions, suggesting no one significantly different in size had driven the car recently. There was no blood inside the vehicle, no signs of violent struggle within the confined space. The evidence suggested the attack had happened outside the car, not inside it. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that Jodi had gotten into someone else's vehicle willingly. Could she have known her attacker? Could someone she trusted have offered her a ride to work, only to drive her somewhere else? This scenario required that Jodi had gathered her belongings, walked to her car, and then for some reason abandoned it and gotten into another vehicle. But that didn't explain the scattered items, the open door, the palm print. The physical evidence simply didn't support a voluntary departure. As the investigation expanded, police began collecting more detailed information about Jodi's life and routines. Her co-workers at KIMT were interviewed extensively. They painted a picture of a dedicated professional who took her job seriously, who was well-liked by everyone in the newsroom, and who had no known conflicts with anyone at the station. Her schedule was predictable. Early mornings for the broadcasts, occasional evening events for station promotions or community appearances. She was building a demo reel, hoping to eventually move to a larger market. She had ambitions, plans, a future she was actively working toward. Friends described Jodi as social and outgoing, someone who had an active personal life outside of work. She enjoyed going out, attending parties, playing golf. She was an avid golfer and spent many weekends on local courses. She dated, though she wasn't in a serious relationship at the time of her disappearance. Several men had expressed romantic interest in her, and investigators would need to track down each one to determine if any might have become obsessed or possessive. The mail and phone records from Jodi's apartment were collected and analyzed. Investigators found nothing immediately alarming, no threatening letters, no disturbing phone calls recorded on her answering machine. Her financial records showed nothing unusual. She wasn't in debt, wasn't being blackmailed, hadn't made any large or suspicious transactions. By all accounts, Jodi Huisentruit was living a normal life as a young professional in a small Midwestern city. But investigators knew that appearances could be deceiving. They began the painstaking process of mapping Jodi's social circle, creating a web of relationships that would need to be examined in detail. There were her close friends like Annie Cruz, whom Jodi had visited the night before her disappearance. There were her co-workers at KIMT. There were the men she dated, including some who might still have held romantic feelings for her. There were the casual acquaintances, the people she knew through her work in the community, the viewers who recognized her from television. And then there was John Vances, the neighbor who seemed to occupy an unusual space in Jodi's life. At 48, he was significantly older than the 27-year-old anchor. Friends would later describe their relationship as friendship, though some found it odd that an older man and a much younger woman spent as much time together as they apparently did. Vances owned a boat, and Jodi sometimes went out on the water with him. They attended some social events together, though not in a way that suggested they were dating. The nature of their relationship would become a source of intense speculation and investigation. Physical evidence from the crime scene was sent to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Laboratory for detailed analysis. Investigators hoped that microscopic examination might reveal fibers, hair, or other trace evidence that wasn't visible to the naked eye. They analyzed the palm print more thoroughly, confirming it was indeed Jodi's, and looking for any other prints that might have been left by an attacker. They examined the scattered items for fingerprints, for DNA, for anything that might provide a lead. The results were disappointing. Beyond confirming what they already knew, that the items belonged to Jodi and bore her fingerprints, the lab work produced no significant new leads. There was no unknown DNA, no fiber that could be traced to a specific garment or location, no smoking gun evidence that pointed clearly to a perpetrator. The crime scene, despite its dramatic appearance, was frustratingly clean from a forensic perspective. This lack of definitive physical evidence pointed to several possibilities. The attacker might have been forensically aware, perhaps someone with knowledge of police procedures who had been careful not to leave evidence. The attack might have been so quick and efficient that the attacker simply hadn't left significant trace evidence, or the evidence that had been left had degraded in the hours between the crime and its discovery, compromised by weather, contamination, or the passage of time. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that the crime scene had been staged. Could someone have scattered Jodi's belongings to make it look like an abduction had occurred in the parking lot, when in fact something else had happened? This theory had problems. Why stage a scene that drew immediate police attention? If someone wanted Jodi to simply disappear, wouldn't it have been more effective to make it look like she'd left voluntarily? The staging theory made little sense given the evidence, but investigators couldn't afford to dismiss any possibility. As word of Jodi's disappearance spread beyond Mason City, media attention intensified. The story had all the elements that capture national interest: a beautiful young woman, a mysterious disappearance, a crime scene that suggested violence, and a complete absence of the victim. Local news outlets covered it extensively, and soon regional and national media picked up the story. Jodi's face appeared on television screens across the country. A bitter irony that the woman who'd worked in television would become known to millions not through her journalism, but through her disappearance. The Mason City Police Department, working with state and federal investigators, set up a tip line and began the overwhelming task of fielding information from the public. In cases like this, tips pour in, some credible, some clearly not, most falling somewhere in between. Every tip had to be logged, evaluated, and investigated. Someone claimed to have seen a woman matching Jodi's description at a gas station 3 states away. Another caller reported suspicious activity in the area around the time of the disappearance. A psychic offered insights into where Jodi's body might be found. Each piece of information, no matter how unlikely, required resources to investigate. Searches began almost immediately. Volunteers combed fields and wooded areas around Mason City, looking for any sign of Jodi or evidence that might have been discarded by whoever took her. Police used bloodhounds to try to track Jodi's scent from the parking lot, hoping the dogs might lead them to where she'd been taken. The dogs indicated a trail leading away from the complex, but it ended at a nearby street, suggesting Jodi had been placed in a vehicle and driven away. After that, the trail went cold. Local waterways were searched, including the Winnebago River and nearby lakes. The horrible possibility that Jodi had been killed and her body disposed of in water had to be considered. Divers searched, boats with sonar equipment scanned the depths, but nothing was found. Wherever Jodi was, she wasn't in the immediate vicinity of Mason City. As the first week of the investigation concluded, the grim reality settled over everyone involved. Jodi Huisentruit was almost certainly the victim of foul play, and whoever had taken her had left behind tantalizingly little evidence. The crime scene told them a violent abduction had occurred, but it didn't tell them who or why. The scattered shoes, the blow dryer, the palm print on red paint, these were the silent witnesses to a crime that had happened in darkness and ended with a woman simply vanishing. The investigation was just beginning, But already it was clear this would not be a case easily solved. The physical evidence, while evocative, was insufficient. The witness statements, while helpful in establishing timeline and background, provided no clear suspect. The search for Jodi Huisentruit would require detectives to dig deep into her life, to examine relationships and interactions, to look for the person who had been waiting in that parking lot or who had arrived at precisely the wrong moment. And as investigators would soon discover, there were more complications in Jodi's life than her bright television smile had ever suggested. There were admirers who'd become too interested, relationships that were more complex than they appeared, and shadows lurking in places no one had thought to look. The scattered clues in parking spot 48 were just the beginning. The real evidence was in the lives and secrets of the people who'd known Jodi Huisentruit, and one of them, investigators believed, held the key to what had happened in those dark hours of June 27, 1995. In the days following Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance, investigators faced a challenge that would define the entire investigation. Too many persons of interest and not enough evidence to eliminate any of them. The search for Jodi had expanded from a crime scene to a complex web of human relationships, each strand requiring careful examination, each connection potentially hiding the answer to what had happened in that parking lot. The question was no longer just where Jodi had gone. It was who had taken her and why. John Vancis emerged early as a focal point of investigative scrutiny, and he would remain there for decades. The nature of his relationship with Jodi raised immediate questions among those who knew them both. Here was a man 21 years her senior, a man who described himself as Jodi's friend, but who seemed unusually invested in her life. Friends of Jodi's later told investigators that while she considered Vancis a friend, some found the dynamic uncomfortable. He was attentive, perhaps overly so. He knew her schedule intimately. He had access to her apartment complex. And crucially, he'd been one of the last people to speak with her before she vanished. Vancis's account of the morning of June 27th would be dissected repeatedly. He claimed Jodi had called him around 4 a.m., requesting a wake-up call, which he provided. But this raised questions. Why would she need a wake-up call from Vancis when she had an alarm clock? Had she been concerned someone might prevent her from waking up? Or was there something else going on between them that made such calls routine? When investigators pressed him on the nature of their relationship, Vancis insisted it was purely platonic friendship, that he enjoyed Jodi's company, and she enjoyed his, and that there was nothing romantic or inappropriate about their connection. But behavior sometimes tells a different story than words. Acquaintances recalled Vancis often speaking about Jodi, seeming proud to be associated with a local television personality. He kept photographs of her. He attended events where she'd be present. Some who knew him wondered if his feelings were more complicated than simple friendship, if perhaps he harbored romantic feelings that Jodi didn't reciprocate, creating an imbalance that could potentially turn dangerous. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Vancis's apartment and vehicle. They were looking for any evidence that might connect him to Jodi's disappearance: blood, hair, fibers, or any of Jodi's belongings. The search yielded items that raised eyebrows. Photographs of Jodi, more than one might expect from a casual friend. Personal items that seemed unusual for him to possess. But nothing definitive, nothing that constituted proof of involvement in her disappearance. No blood evidence, no signs of struggle, no clear indication that Jodi had been in his apartment or vehicle that morning. Vancis agreed to speak with investigators multiple times in those early days, answering questions about his whereabouts, his relationship with Jodi, and what he knew about her life. He maintained his innocence consistently, expressing concern for Jodi and cooperation with the investigation. But investigators noted something in his demeanor, a level of control, a measured quality to his responses that some found suspicious. Was he simply a man being careful with his words because he knew he was under suspicion? Or was he a man who knew exactly what had happened and was carefully navigating questions to avoid incrimination? The investigation into Vancis intensified when investigators learned more about his background. He'd had some legal troubles in the past, nothing violent, but it established that he wasn't unfamiliar with the criminal justice system. More concerning were the accounts from some who knew him, describing possessive tendencies. A man who could become fixated on people and things. If Jodi had wanted to distance herself from him, if she begun to find his attention uncomfortable, could that have triggered a violent response? Vancis eventually agreed to take a polygraph examination, a decision that some saw as evidence of innocence. A guilty man wouldn't voluntarily subject himself to such scrutiny. while others viewed it as the calculated move of someone confident they could beat the test. The results were inconclusive, or, as is often the case with polygraphs, open to interpretation. He showed deception on some questions, according to some analysts, while others felt the results were ambiguous. Polygraphs are not admissible in court for good reason. They're notoriously unreliable, influenced by nervousness, by the skill of the examiner, by a subject's physiological responses that may or may not correlate with truthfulness. But Vances wasn't the only person investigators needed to scrutinize. Jodi's romantic life, while not dramatically complicated, included several men who had to be investigated. There was an ex-boyfriend from her time in Minnesota, someone she dated seriously before moving to Mason City. The relationship had ended, but had it ended badly? Did he harbor resentment or hope for reconciliation? Investigators tracked him down and interviewed him extensively. His alibi for the morning of June 27th was solid. He was in Minnesota, hours away, with multiple witnesses confirming his location. He was eliminated as a direct suspect, though investigators kept him on their radar in case he'd been involved in some indirect way. Then there were the more casual relationships, the dates that hadn't evolved into anything serious. Several men had expressed interest in Jodi in the months before her disappearance. Some of these interactions were perfectly normal, mutual attraction, a few dates, things not working out. But others had a different quality. There were men who'd asked Jodi out repeatedly, who hadn't seemed to accept her polite refusals, who'd continued to pursue her despite her lack of reciprocal interest. In the vocabulary of modern dating, these would be called stalkers. In 1995, they were often dismissed as persistent admirers. One name that surfaced repeatedly was that of a man who'd been particularly persistent in pursuing Jodi. Co-workers recalled him showing up at the station, ostensibly to deliver something or speak with her about some matter, but doing so with a frequency that seemed excessive. Jodi had mentioned to friends that she found his attention uncomfortable, but hadn't felt threatened enough to report it to police. This man became a person of interest, and investigators interviewed him extensively. His alibi for the morning of the disappearance was less solid than they would have liked. He claimed to have been at home, alone, asleep. Exactly the kind of alibi that's impossible to verify. He had no witnesses to confirm his location, no phone calls or other records that definitively placed him elsewhere. Investigators looked at his vehicle, his background, his known movements in the days before Jodi vanished. They found someone who'd clearly been infatuated with her, who'd been rejected by her, and who couldn't account for his whereabouts at the crucial time. But they also found no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, no witness who'd seen him at the Key Apartments that morning, nothing concrete to transform suspicion into charges. The investigation also had to consider the possibility of a complete stranger, someone Jodi had never met, someone who'd targeted her randomly or who'd been watching her without her knowledge. Mason City in the mid-90s was generally safe, but it wasn't immune to transient criminal activity. Interstate 35 ran near the city, providing easy access for people passing through the area. Could someone traveling through have spotted Jodi, perhaps seen her on television and become fixated, followed her home, and learned her schedule? This scenario was harder to investigate because it meant casting a much wider net. Investigators looked at similar crimes in surrounding states, trying to find patterns that might match Jodi's disappearance. Were there other cases of young women being abducted in the pre-dawn hours? Were there serial offenders who might have been in the area? They contacted other law enforcement agencies, shared information, looked for connections. Some cases bore superficial similarities, but none matched closely enough to suggest a definite link. The investigation also turned its attention to viewers of KIMT, who might have developed an unhealthy fixation on Jodi. As a television personality, she was in people's homes every morning, creating a false sense of intimacy that could sometimes lead disturbed individuals to believe they had a relationship with her. The station received fan mail for its on-air personalities, and investigators went through it all, looking for anything that seemed inappropriate or threatening. Most of it was benign, viewers complimenting her work, commenting on stories she'd covered. But there were a few letters that made investigators pause. One viewer had written to Jodi multiple times, letters that started friendly but became increasingly personal, asking questions about her private life, making comments about her appearance that crossed the line from complimentary to creepy. The station had flagged these letters at the time, and Jodi had been made aware of them, but they'd seemed like the kind of uncomfortable but not directly threatening correspondence that public figures sometimes receive. Now, in light of her disappearance, Every word was analyzed for potential meaning. Investigators tracked down the letter writer and interviewed him. He seemed eccentric but harmless, and like so many others, he had no verifiable alibi, but also no evidence connecting him to the crime. As weeks turned into months, the investigation generated thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of interviews, and a growing sense of frustration among investigators. They had a wealth of information, but a poverty of evidence. They knew Jodi had been taken from that parking lot. They knew it had happened quickly and violently. They knew that whoever had taken her had either been extraordinarily lucky or had planned carefully enough to avoid leaving definitive evidence. But they couldn't identify that person with certainty. The case began to take its toll on the investigators themselves. Detective J.D. Smith, who'd been at the crime scene on day one, found himself thinking about Jodi constantly. He looked at the photographs from the parking lot, those scattered shoes, that palm print, and felt the weight of an unsolved case pressing down on him. Every lead that fizzled out was a small death of hope. Every promising tip that led nowhere was another reminder that somewhere, someone who'd committed a terrible crime was free, perhaps confident they'd gotten away with it. The community of Mason City rallied around the investigation, but as time passed, the intensity of public attention began to wane. In the immediate aftermath of Jodi's disappearance, her face had been everywhere, on television, in newspapers, on posters and storefronts. Volunteers had turned out in droves to search for her. The tip line had been flooded with calls. But as months passed without resolution, without even a major break in the case, the story began to fade from front pages. Life moved on, as it inevitably does, even as Jodi remained missing, and those who loved her remained trapped in a terrible uncertainty. Jodi's family, her parents, her sister, lived in a special kind of hell. They'd come to Mason City immediately after learning of her disappearance, had stayed to help with searches, had done media appearances, pleading for information. Her mother's face, aged by grief and fear, became a fixture at press conferences. The family held out hope that Jodi might somehow still be alive, that perhaps she'd been taken but not killed, that somewhere she might be waiting for rescue. But as time passed, hope became harder to sustain. The statistics on abduction cases were brutal. If someone isn't found within the first 48 hours, the likelihood of finding them alive drops precipitously. Investigators had to balance the family's need for hope with the realities of what the evidence suggested. The violence of the crime scene, the complete absence of any contact from Jodi, the lack of any ransom demand or communication, all pointed to a scenario where Jodi had been killed shortly after her abduction. But without a body, without proof of death, the case remained a missing persons investigation rather than a homicide. This distinction affected how resources were allocated, how the case was classified, and how investigators approached their work. The question of what had been done with Jodi's body, assuming she had been killed, became another focus of investigation. Where does someone hide a body in and around Mason City, Iowa? The area offered various possibilities. Rural farmland with countless fields and isolated areas, bodies of water where a weighted corpse might never surface, abandoned buildings or wells where remains could be concealed. Investigators worked with K-9 units trained in detecting human remains, searching areas based on tips or on strategic assessments of where a perpetrator might have gone. One particularly promising tip came from a woman who claimed her ex-boyfriend had made suspicious comments around the time of Jodi's disappearance, mentioning having seen something that morning, acting strangely in the days after. Investigators interviewed this man extensively. He'd been in Mason City on June 27th, had no solid alibi for the early morning hours, and couldn't explain some inconsistencies in his account. He became a serious person of interest, and investigators obtained warrants to search his property. They brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan areas of his land where the soil had been disturbed. They dug, they analyzed, and they found nothing connecting him to Jodi's disappearance. This pattern repeated itself throughout the investigation, promising leads that ultimately led nowhere, persons of interest who looked suspicious until they didn't, tips that seemed credible until they proved false. The investigation became a maze where every corridor looked like it might lead to the center, but instead circled back to the same frustrating place. Too much suspicion, too little proof. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. As the first anniversary of Jodi's disappearance approached, investigators had to confront a difficult reality. Despite an enormous expenditure of time and resources, despite the involvement of local, state, and federal agencies, Despite the thousands of tips and hundreds of interviews, they were no closer to definitively solving the case than they'd been on day one. They had suspects, Vance's chief among them, but others as well, but they had no evidence strong enough to charge anyone. They had theories, but theories without proof are just speculation. The case remained open, investigators remained committed, but the urgent, all-hands-on-deck intensity of those first weeks and months had necessarily evolved into something more sustainable and long-term. Jodi's case became one of many files that detectives carried with them, one they returned to regularly, hoping for the break that would finally bring resolution. New tips still came in periodically, and each one was investigated with care, because you never knew which piece of information might be the one that cracked the case open. But in the quiet moments, when investigators sat alone with the case files, looking at those photographs from the parking lot, they were haunted by questions. Who had been waiting in the darkness that morning? What had driven them to attack a woman who, by all accounts, brought light into the world? Where had they taken her? And perhaps most frustratingly, how had they gotten away with it? Because that's what seemed like they'd done. Someone had committed a terrible crime in a small city where everyone supposedly knew everyone, and they'd disappeared back into the fabric of the community, or had left entirely, without leaving behind enough evidence to bring them to justice. The scattered clues in parking spot 48 had told investigators that a crime had occurred, but the clues couldn't tell them the most important things: who, why, and where. Those answers remained locked away somewhere, known to the perpetrator and perhaps to no one else, waiting to be discovered if the right key could ever be found. And as year followed year, that discovery seemed increasingly unlikely, the mystery deepening with time rather than resolving, the case of Jodi Huisentruit becoming not just an investigation, but a lingering wound in the heart of Mason City, a constant reminder that even in safe places, terrible things can happen, and sometimes the monsters who commit them simply vanish into thin air. The investigation into Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance became a study in persistence against impossible odds. As the case stretched from months into years, then from years into decades, investigators faced a challenge familiar to anyone who's worked cold cases. How do you maintain momentum when every promising lead seems to evaporate like morning fog? The answer, for those who refused to let Jodi be forgotten, was to keep searching, keep questioning, keep hoping that somewhere in the accumulated mountain of information was the detail that would finally make everything click into place. By the late 90s, the investigation had generated more than 15,000 pages of documents, documented tips from across the country, and consumed thousands of hours of investigative time. The Mason City Police Department had worked the case harder than any in their history, but the frustrating reality remained. Jodi was still missing, and no one had been charged with any crime related to her disappearance. The case had reached what investigators dreaded most. It had gone cold. But cold didn't mean forgotten. Detective teams changed over the years as officers retired or moved to other positions, but each new investigator who inherited the Huisentruit file felt the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just a collection of reports and evidence bags. This was a young woman's life, interrupted and stolen. This was a family that deserved answers. This was a crime that demanded resolution, no matter how much time had passed. John Vances remained a most enduring figure of investigative interest. His relationship with Jodi, his proximity to the crime, his opportunity, and certain inconsistencies in his statements kept him at the center of suspicion. In 2003, nearly a decade after Jodi's disappearance, investigators made a decision that reflected both their desperation and their conviction. They executed another search warrant on Vances' property. This time, they were looking for Jodi's body. Vances had by then moved to a property outside Mason City, and investigators had received information suggesting that Jodi might have been buried there. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and excavation equipment. The search was extensive and thorough, examining areas where the dogs had alerted, where radar suggested possible disturbances in the soil. News crews filmed from a distance as investigators dug, as the community watched and waited, hoping this might finally be the break that brought Jodi home. They found nothing. No remains, no personal effects, no evidence that Jodi had ever been on that property. The search, which had generated renewed hope and media attention, ended in bitter disappointment. Vances maintained his innocence throughout, expressing frustration at being repeatedly targeted by investigators. He gave interviews to local media, portraying himself as a grieving friend who'd been unjustly suspected, someone whose life had been upended by his association with a woman he'd cared about but had no role in harming. The question of Vance's involvement became one of the most debated aspects of the case. Those who suspected him pointed to his relationship with Jodi, his knowledge of her schedule, his opportunity, and what they perceived as evasive or inconsistent statements. They noted that he'd never been definitively cleared, that despite repeated searches and interviews, investigators couldn't eliminate him as a suspect. But those who doubted his involvement, including some investigators, pointed out that decades of scrutiny had produced no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. No witnesses had placed him at the key apartments that morning. No forensic evidence linked him to Jodi's disappearance. Suspicion, no matter how strong, isn't evidence. The investigation also continued to explore other possibilities. In 2001, investigators announced they were looking closely at a convicted serial killer named Tracy Wiersma, who'd been operating in the Midwest during the mid-90s. Wiersma had been convicted of murdering a woman in Minnesota, and investigators wondered if his crimes might extend further. Had he been in Mason City on June 27, 1995? Could Jodi have been one of his victims? The theory had a certain appeal. It would explain the lack of evidence connecting anyone in Jodi's circle to her disappearance. A serial predator passing through would have no prior connection to her, no obvious motive, no reason to be on investigators' radar. But after extensive investigation, this lead also failed to produce results. Wiersma's known movements and the details of his confirmed crimes didn't match the circumstances of Jodi's disappearance. There was no evidence placing him in Mason City at the relevant time. No connection between him and Jodi. The theory was set aside, another promising possibility that ultimately led nowhere. As technology advanced, investigators hoped that new forensic techniques might breathe life into the old evidence. DNA analysis had advanced considerably since 1995, becoming more sensitive and capable of extracting information from smaller samples. Investigators went back to the evidence collected from the crime scene, the items scattered in the parking lot, samples taken from Jodi's car, anything that might have been touched by the perpetrator. They submitted it all for modern DNA analysis, hoping that techniques unavailable in the 90s might now reveal something crucial. The results were disappointing. The evidence simply didn't contain the kind of biological material that would yield a DNA profile. Either the perpetrator had been careful not to leave such evidence, or it had degraded over time, or the violent but brief nature of the attack simply hadn't resulted in the transfer of DNA in a way that could be recovered and analyzed. Once again, technology and determination ran headlong into the brick wall of insufficient evidence. In 2011, a major development reignited public interest in the case. A cold case team announced they'd identified a new person of interest, someone who'd been known to Jodi, but who hadn't been a focus of the initial investigation. The individual's name wasn't publicly released, but investigators indicated they were pursuing this lead vigorously. The announcement generated headlines, renewed media coverage, and hope among those who'd followed the case for years. Finally, perhaps, investigators had found something new. But as with so many promising developments in this case, the lead ultimately didn't result in charges. Whatever information had made this person a subject of interest wasn't sufficient to prove involvement in Jodi's disappearance. The investigation continued, but the person of interest faded from public discussion, their role in the case remaining one of many unresolved questions. Throughout these years, tips continued to come in. Some were clearly the work of attention seekers or individuals with mental health issues, claiming knowledge they couldn't possibly have or making accusations that didn't withstand even basic scrutiny. But others seemed more credible, coming from people who genuinely believed they had information relevant to the case. A woman called to say her ex-husband had made strange comments about Jodi years earlier. A former co-worker of someone suspicious shared concerns about that person's behavior. A farmer reported finding items in a field that might have belonged to Jodi. Each tip required investigation, consuming resources and time, and each one eventually proved insufficient to move the case forward. The Huisentruit family, meanwhile, lived in a state of perpetual suspension. Jodi's parents, Joanne and Maurice, maintained hope for years that their daughter might somehow still be alive, that they might receive a phone call one day saying she'd been found. But as the years accumulated, that hope became harder to sustain. In 2007, 12 years after Jodi vanished, the family made the painful decision to have her declared legally dead. It was a practical necessity for estate and legal purposes, but it also represented a heartbreaking acknowledgement of reality. Jodi wasn't coming home. Joanne Huisentruit became an advocate for missing persons, channeling her grief into action, working to raise awareness about cases like her daughter's. She gave interviews, participated in vigils, and connected with other families experiencing the same nightmare of having a loved one vanish without trace. In 2014, Joanne passed away, never having received the answer she'd sought for 19 years. Her death added another layer of tragedy to the case. A mother who died without knowing what had happened to her child, without seeing justice served. The case attracted significant attention from true crime enthusiasts, investigative journalists, and documentary producers. Dateline NBC, 48 Hours, and other programs featured Jodi's disappearance, bringing it to national audiences. In 2011, a book titled Dead Air, The Disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit, by Beth Bedner provided an exhaustive examination of the case, compiling years of investigation into a comprehensive narrative. Podcasts dedicated episodes to analyzing the evidence, debating theories, and keeping public attention focused on an unsolved mystery that refused to fade away. This media attention served multiple purposes. It kept Jodi's name in the public consciousness, ensuring that new generations became aware of her case. It applied indirect pressure on investigators to continue working the case actively. And it generated new tips, as people who'd been children in 1995 grew up and potentially remembered something their parents had discussed, or as individuals who'd had information but been afraid to come forward found the courage to contact authorities. One theory that gained traction in online communities was that Jodi might have been killed by someone in law enforcement or with connections to law enforcement. This theory attempted to explain why the crime scene had been so clean from a forensic perspective and why the investigation had repeatedly hit dead ends. A person with knowledge of police procedures might have been able to avoid leaving evidence, might have known how to mislead an investigation, might have had access to information about what investigators were focusing on. But this theory was highly speculative, based more on frustration with the lack of resolution than on actual evidence, pointing to law enforcement involvement. Another theory suggested organized crime connections. Iowa in the 90s wasn't free from organized criminal activity, and some theorists suggested Jodi might have inadvertently witnessed something, perhaps while covering a story, or in her personal life, that made her a target. But again, there was no evidence supporting this theory. Jodi's work at KIMT had been routine local news coverage, nothing that would have brought her into contact with organized crime. Her personal life, while scrutinized exhaustively, revealed no connections to criminal organizations. The most persistent theory, held by many investigators and close followers of the case, was the simplest. Someone in Jodi's circle, someone she knew and perhaps trusted, had killed her. This theory fit the evidence better than others. The attack appeared targeted rather than random. The perpetrator seemed to know Jodi's schedule, know she'd be alone in that parking lot at that hour. The crime scene suggested someone who'd been able to approach Jodi without immediately alarming her, someone who'd gotten close enough to attack before she could flee or effectively defend herself. And the complete lack of physical evidence suggested someone who'd been forensically aware or extraordinarily lucky. If this theory was correct, then the perpetrator was someone investigators had already interviewed, perhaps multiple times. Someone who'd sat across from detectives and lied, who'd maintained their composure while being questioned about their relationship with Jodi, who'd hidden their involvement successfully for decades. This possibility was both frustrating and frightening. The idea that the answer had been within reach all along, but had remained just out of grasp, protected by lack of evidence. By the 2010s, the case had acquired something of a mythic quality in true crime circles. It had all the elements that make a case enduringly fascinating. A sympathetic victim, a violent crime with minimal evidence, a cast of suspicious characters, and decades without resolution. People who'd never been to Mason City, Iowa, knew Jodi's name and face. Amateur detectives pored over the case files that had been made public, developing their own theories, debating with each other on internet forums about who was most likely responsible. In 2017, on the 22nd anniversary of Jodi's disappearance, the Mason City Police Department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation held a press conference to announce they were still actively working the case. They revealed that they'd been using new investigative techniques, including advanced DNA analysis and digital forensics. They appealed once again for anyone with information to come forward. The press conference was a message. This case wasn't forgotten. Investigators hadn't given up, and someone out there still had answers that needed to be shared. The renewed focus brought a surge of new tips, some more credible than others. Investigators followed up on each one, hoping that after 22 years, something new might emerge. But once again, the tips led nowhere definitive. The case remained frustratingly unresolved, the evidence still insufficient to charge anyone, the mystery as deep as ever. Technology continued to advance, offering new possibilities. Genetic genealogy, the technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer, represented a potential breakthrough for cold cases. If investigators had DNA from Jodi's attacker, they could potentially use genealogy databases to identify relatives of the perpetrator and work backward to find them. But this technique required having a DNA sample to work with, and that was precisely what the Huisentruit investigation lacked. The evidence simply didn't contain usable DNA from anyone other than Jodi herself. Investigators also explored whether social media and digital records might provide new leads. In 1995, the digital footprint we all leave today simply didn't exist. But by the 2000s, people were documenting their lives online, and investigators wondered if someone might have posted something incriminating, might have made a comment that revealed knowledge of the crime. They searched, they monitored, they investigated, but again found nothing that advanced the case. The investigation had become a testament to both dedication and frustration. Generations of investigators had worked the case, each bringing fresh eyes and new techniques, each hoping to be the one who finally solved it. But the Huisentruit case seemed to resist solution, as if the answer was hidden just beyond reach, visible enough to tantalize, but protected by some invisible barrier that prevented investigators from quite grasping it. Some investigators who'd worked the case for years had their own private theories about what had happened. They developed hunches based on years of experience, on subtle details and witness statements, on the way certain persons of interest had behaved when questioned. But hunches aren't evidence. Theories aren't proof. And without the evidence needed to charge someone, to bring them to trial, to finally give the Huisentruit family and the community of Mason City the answers and justice they deserved, the case remained what it had been for decades, one of Iowa's most notorious unsolved mysteries. As the case approached its 30th anniversary, the reality was stark. Whoever had taken Jodi Huisentruit on that June morning in 1995 had gotten away with it. They'd either died, taking their secret to the grave, or they were still out there, living their life, carrying the knowledge of what they'd done. And somewhere, Jodi's remains lay undiscovered, waiting to be found, waiting to finally come home and provide the answers that had eluded everyone for so long. The dead ends were numerous, the theories plentiful, but the resolution remained as elusive as it had been on day one, a case that seemed like it should have been solvable, but had proven to be anything but. There's a particular kind of pain that comes with unresolved loss, a wound that never quite heals because closure never arrives. For the people of Mason City, Iowa, Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance became more than just a crime. It became a haunting presence in the community's collective memory, a reminder that safety is sometimes an illusion, and that even in places where everyone knows everyone, darkness can find a way in. Nearly 3 decades have passed since that June morning in 1995, and the questions remain as urgent as ever. What happened to Jodi Huisentruit? Who took her? And why has justice remained so stubbornly out of reach? The passage of time has transformed the case in ways both expected and surprising. Witnesses who were in their 20s and 30s when Jodi disappeared are now in their 50s and 60s. Some have died, taking whatever they knew or didn't know with them. The physical landscape has changed too. The key apartments where Jodi lived and where the crime occurred still stand on North Kentucky Avenue, but they've changed ownership and management multiple times. New residents come and go, most unaware that they're living in a place forever marked by tragedy. Parking spot 48, where Jodi's scattered belongings told a story of violence and abduction, looks like any other parking space now, just asphalt and painted lines, offering no hint of the horror it once witnessed. KMTTV, where Jodi worked and dreamed of bigger markets and brighter futures, continues to broadcast the morning news. But the faces are different now. The technology has advanced from the bulky cameras and editing equipment of the mid-90s to sleek digital systems. Yet Jodi's memory remains present at the station. Current employees know the story, know that their workplace is forever connected to one of Iowa's most infamous unsolved cases. On significant anniversaries, the station runs retrospectives, keeping Jodi's story alive for viewers who might not remember or who weren't yet born when she vanished. The investigation, while no longer the all-consuming priority it once was, remains officially open and active. The Mason City Police Department, now working in partnership with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and occasionally consulting with federal agencies, maintains a file that has grown to encompass decades of work. New leads, when they come in, are still investigated. New technologies are applied to old evidence whenever possible. The commitment to solving the case persists, even as the realistic hope of resolution has dimmed with each passing year. In 2021, the 26th anniversary of Jodi's disappearance brought renewed attention when investigators announced they were focusing on a small circle of people they believed had information about what happened. They didn't name names publicly, but the implication was clear. Investigators believed they knew who was responsible, or at least who had knowledge of the crime. The challenge was proving it. Without physical evidence, without witnesses willing to come forward, without a confession, the case remained stuck in the same place it had been for years. Strong suspicions but insufficient proof. This announcement sparked debate among those who'd followed the case for years. Was it a genuine investigative development, or was it a strategic move designed to pressure someone into talking? Were investigators trying to signal to someone in that small circle that they knew, hoping guilt or fear might finally loosen a tongue that had remained silent for decades? The tactic, if that's what it was, didn't produce immediate results. No one came forward with a confession. No major break materialized. The case continued in its state of frustrating suspension. John Vances, who'd lived under the shadow of suspicion for decades, passed away in 2021 at the age of 74. His death prompted a flurry of speculation. Would investigators now be able to speak more freely about evidence they developed against him? Would people who'd been reluctant to implicate him while he was alive come forward now? Did he take the truth to his grave? To date, no definitive answers have emerged. Some investigators believe Vances was involved in Jodi's disappearance, perhaps even responsible for it. Others aren't convinced, pointing to the lack of physical evidence and the possibility that focusing so intensely on him might have caused investigators to overlook other possibilities. The question of what was done with Jodi's body, assuming she was killed, which seems almost certain given the circumstances, remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Where do you hide a body so effectively that decades of searching can't locate it? Northern Iowa offers countless possibilities. Rural farmland stretches for miles in every direction from Mason City. Thousands of acres of fields and wooded areas where remains could be buried and never found. Bodies of water, rivers, lakes, quarries, where a weighted corpse might sink and stay submerged indefinitely. Abandoned wells, old buildings, remote areas that see no human traffic from one year to the next. Over the years, specific locations have been searched based on tips or investigative theories. In 2003, as mentioned earlier, Vances's property was extensively searched. In 2017, investigators focused on an area near Prairie Lake, acting on information suggesting Jodi's body might have been disposed of there. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched the water. Ground was excavated. Nothing was found. Each unsuccessful search adds to the frustration and deepens the mystery. Either the body was disposed of with remarkable effectiveness, or investigators simply haven't looked in the right place yet, or natural processes have scattered or destroyed the remains beyond recognition. The Huisentruit family has endured nearly 3 decades of not knowing. Jodi's father, Maurice, who passed away in 2009, never received answers about what happened to his daughter. Her mother, Joanne, died in 2014 with the same terrible uncertainty. Jodi's sister, Joanne Nath, named after their mother, has become the family spokesperson, continuing to advocate for the case, speaking with media, coordinating with investigators, and holding out hope that someday, somehow, resolution will come. The annual vigils held on the anniversary of Jodi's disappearance have become smaller over the years, a natural consequence of time passing and people moving on with their lives. But a dedicated core remains, people who never knew Jodi personally but feel connected to her story, who believe that remembering her and keeping pressure on for justice is important. They gather at the Key Apartments, place flowers in parking spot 48, share memories and theories, and renew their commitment to never forgetting. The case has taken on symbolic significance beyond the specifics of what happened to one woman in one Iowa city. Jodi's disappearance represents all the missing persons cases that go unsolved, all the families who never get answers, all the perpetrators who escape justice. Her story has been used to advocate for better resources for investigating missing persons cases, for improved forensic techniques, for legal changes that might make it easier to bring cases to trial even in the absence of a body. The Jodi's Law proposals that have been discussed over the years would lower the standard of proof required in certain circumstances, though concerns about convicting innocent people based on circumstantial evidence have prevented such laws from being widely adopted. True crime enthusiasts continue to dissect every aspect of the case, developing elaborate theories that range from plausible to fantastical. Online communities dedicated to unsolved mysteries maintain active threads about Jodi, with amateur sleuths sharing their analyses, debating the likelihood of various suspects, and occasionally claiming to have identified the perpetrator based on their reading of the evidence. While most of these amateur investigations lead nowhere, there's always the possibility that fresh eyes might notice something investigators missed, that someone outside law enforcement might make a connection that brings the case closer to resolution. Advances in technology continue to offer hope, even as previous technological promises have failed to deliver. Artificial intelligence systems that can analyze vast amounts of data and identify patterns might be applied to the thousands of pages of investigative reports, potentially finding connections that human investigators overlooked. Improved DNA analysis techniques might someday extract usable genetic material from evidence that current technology can't process. Social media archives and digital records that didn't exist in 1995 might contain information relevant to the case, posted innocently or carelessly by someone who knew something they shouldn't have known. But technology alone won't solve this case. What's needed is either physical evidence that definitively connects someone to the crime, or human testimony, someone who knows something finally deciding to speak. The latter possibility becomes less likely with each passing year as witnesses age, as memories fade, as the people who might have had information die off. But it also becomes more possible in certain ways. Someone who was protecting a friend or family member 30 years ago might be less inclined to do so now. Someone who was afraid to speak up in 1995 might find courage as they approach the end of their own life and want to unburden their conscience. Relationships that kept people silent might have ended, removing the loyalty that prevented them from talking. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Investigators have long theorized that someone out there knows what happened to Jodi. Perhaps they're the perpetrator themselves, living with the knowledge of what they did, wondering if today will be the day they finally get caught. Perhaps there's someone who helped dispose of evidence or who provided an alibi, complicit in the crime even if they didn't commit the actual abduction. Perhaps there's someone who saw something that morning, or heard something, or noticed something unusual, but for whatever reason chose not to come forward or convince themselves it wasn't important. That person, whoever they are, holds the key to solving a case that has haunted Iowa for nearly 3 decades. The most likely scenario, based on the evidence and the opinions of most investigators who've worked the case, is that Jodi was killed shortly after being taken from a parking lot. The attack was violent enough to leave scattered belongings and a palm print suggesting struggle. The perpetrator wouldn't have wanted to risk transporting a living, fighting, screaming victim any farther than necessary. The most probable sequence is that Jodi was grabbed in the parking lot, forced into a vehicle, killed quickly, perhaps within minutes or hours, and her body disposed of in a location the perpetrator felt confident wouldn't be searched or where remains would be difficult to find. This scenario means that somewhere within a reasonable distance of Mason City, perhaps within an hour's drive, possibly much closer, Jodi's remains lie waiting to be discovered. Every so often, when someone reports finding bones in a field or a remote area, there's a moment of terrible hope that it might finally be Jodi. But each time, the bones prove to be animal remains, or they're human but from someone else's tragedy, someone else's unsolved case. The landscape keeps its secrets, and Jodi remains missing. The psychological impact of an unsolved case like this extends far beyond the immediate family and investigators. It affects the entire community in subtle but real ways. There's a loss of innocence, a recognition that bad things can happen anywhere, that the safety people took for granted was never absolute. For women living alone in Mason City, particularly those who work early morning hours, Jodi's case is a cautionary tale that likely influences their decisions about security, about parking locations, about being aware of their surroundings. The case has rippled outward through time, touching people who never knew Jodi, but who know her story and carry it with them as a reminder that the world can be dangerous in unexpected ways. There's also a peculiar phenomenon that occurs with long unsolved cases. They become part of local lore, passed down through generations. Children growing up in Mason City in the 2000s and 2010s hear about Jodi Huisentruit. Hear the story of the pretty news anchor who disappeared one morning and was never found. It becomes something between history and legend, a cautionary tale that parents might reference when teaching their children about safety. Future generations will likely still know the name Jodi Huisentruit, even if the specifics of her life beyond her disappearance fade from collective memory. For those who knew Jodi personally, the passage of time brings a different kind of pain. They've lived 30 years that Jodi didn't get to live. They've had careers, marriages, children, grandchildren, all the experiences of a full life that Jodi was denied. They're now decades older than Jodi will ever be, aging while she remains forever 27 in photographs and video clips. Friends who were young with her are now middle-aged or approaching retirement, carrying memories of someone who exists for them in a permanent past tense, frozen in an age they've long since surpassed. Amy Kunz, who made that worried phone call to Jodi's apartment on the morning she disappeared, who was the last co-worker to speak with her, has had to live with that final conversation for 3 decades. The panic in Jodi's voice when she said she'd overslept, the rushed tone of someone late for work. Those are the last impressions Amy has of her friend. There's no closure to that relationship, no final goodbye that provided any sense of ending. Just a phone call, and then absence. The case has been examined in countless true crime documentaries, podcast episodes, and news retrospectives. Each retelling brings new audiences who become invested in finding out what happened. Some become obsessed, dedicating significant time to researching the case, to visiting Mason City and seeing the locations for themselves, to developing their own theories about what occurred. This crowdsourced investigation hasn't solved the case, but it has kept it in the public consciousness in a way that might not have happened for a crime in a small Iowa city 3 decades ago. What would it take to finally solve this case? The honest answer is that we don't know. It might take a deathbed confession from someone who's carried the secret for decades. It might take a new witness coming forward with information they've never shared before. It might take remains being discovered by accident, a construction project, an environmental change, a hiker stumbling across something in a remote area. It might take a breakthrough in forensic technology that allows investigators to extract evidence from materials they've already collected. Or it might take something else entirely, some development that no one has yet anticipated. What seems increasingly unlikely is that traditional investigative methods alone will solve the case. The interviews have been conducted, the evidence has been analyzed, the suspects have been investigated. If the answer was going to emerge from conventional police work, it probably would have emerged by now. That doesn't mean investigators should stop trying. Cold cases have been solved after even longer periods, sometimes because someone finally decided to talk, sometimes because technology finally caught up with old evidence. But it does mean that solving the Jodi Huisentruit case will likely require some element of luck in addition to skill and persistence. The question of whether there will ever be justice for Jodi weighs heavily on everyone who's followed the case. Justice would mean more than just knowing what happened. It would mean someone being held accountable, being charged, standing trial, facing consequences for taking a life and devastating a family. But as time passes, that form of justice becomes less likely. Suspects age and die. Evidence degrades. Witnesses' memories become less reliable. The window for traditional criminal justice narrows with each passing year. Yet there's another form of justice that remains possible even if no one is ever charged: truth. Knowing what happened, understanding the circumstances of Jodi's death, being able to bring her remains home for proper burial. These things wouldn't erase the crime or fully heal the wounds, but they would provide something that the family and community have been denied for 3 decades. Truth is a form of justice, even imperfect truth, even truth that comes too late to punish the guilty. It's the minimum that Jodi Huisentruit deserves, the least that should be granted after so many years of absence. As this case enters its 4th decade, the generation that remembers Jodi as a living presence is aging. Soon, the case will be known only through records and retellings, through photographs and videos, through the stories passed down by those who knew her. But the questions will remain, as will the commitment, at least among some, to continue seeking answers. The echo of Jodi's absence reverberates through time, a sound that hasn't diminished despite the decades, a reminder that some mysteries refuse to be relegated to history. On quiet mornings in Mason City, when the sun rises over the flat Iowa landscape much as it did on June 27, 1995, you can drive past the Key Apartments and see parking spot 48. It looks ordinary now, indistinguishable from the spots on either side of it. Cars park there regularly, their drivers unaware or unconcerned about what happened there almost 30 years ago. But for those who remember, for those who know the story, that spot will forever be marked by what occurred there. The scattered shoes, the blow dryer, the palm print on red paint, and the woman who vanished without a trace. Jodi Huisentruit would be 57 years old now if she'd lived. She might have achieved her dream of working in a larger television market, or she might have stayed in Iowa and built a different kind of life. She might have married, had children, experienced all the joys and sorrows that come with decades of living. We'll never know what she might have become because someone took that future from her on a dark June morning, and they've never been held accountable for that theft. The case remains open. Investigators continue to welcome tips. The family continues to seek answers. The community continues to remember. And somewhere, in a prison cell, a nursing home, a house in a quiet neighborhood, or a grave, someone knows what happened to Jodi Huisentruit. They know where she is. They know the truth that has eluded everyone else for nearly 30 years. Whether that truth will ever be revealed is a question that only time can answer. But until it is, the echo of Jodi's absence will continue to reverberate, a silent scream frozen in time, waiting for someone to finally hear it and respond with the truth that has been too long denied. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The parking lot at the Key Apartments is empty now in the pre-dawn hours, just as it was on that June morning. But it will never truly be empty. It will always hold the memory of a young woman who left her apartment rushing to work, who never made it to her car, who vanished into darkness and has never returned. That memory is Jodi Huisentruit's legacy, not the television career she was building, not the bright future she had planned, but the haunting mystery of her disappearance and the questions that refused to die. And until those questions are answered, the clock continues ticking on a case that has already consumed 3 decades and shows no sign of resolution. The Crime O'Clock keeps counting, and Jodi's time remains frozen at 4:30 a.m. on June 27, 1995, the moment when everything changed and nothing was ever the same again. Thank you for following Jodi Huisentruit's story. Her case remains unsolved, but investigators continue to seek information. If you have any knowledge about this case, please contact the Mason City Police Department or the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation.